The photograph was wrong. Curator Velanthas had reviewed 11,000 planetary intake files in her career with the Dominion Cartography Bureau, and she knew what conquest documentation looked like. She knew the shape of submission, the suppression signatures, the resource extraction timelines, the population compliance curves that all followed the same gentle downward slope after a species encountered a Dominion expansion fleet for the first time. But the photograph pinned to the top of humanity's intake file, a single physical image recovered from a destroyed probe, showed something she couldn't categorize. A human child, standing alone on a stretch of gray rubble that might have been a city once, holding something small and alive, a creature with fur. The child was not crying. The child was not fleeing. The child was smiling. Velanthas set the photograph down slowly. What are you, asterisk, she thought. What are you exactly? She had no idea that this question, asked by dozens of species before her, in 100 different dialects, over 3 centuries of careful observation, had never once been answered to anyone's satisfaction. The Dominion War Council met on the 7th rotation of the hegemony calendar, and Velanthas was the only civilian in the room. This was unusual enough that every commander present had already decided she was either very important or very expendable. She suspected the council hadn't determined which yet. "The file summary," said Fleet Lord Dravik, a being whose species communicated primarily through pressure changes in their exoskeleton, which made his translated Dominion standard carry a flatness that humans, had any been present, might have mistaken for boredom, indicates that human space remains the single largest unclaimed territory in the Central Arm. 17 inhabited systems, pre-FTL within living memory, a military capacity we have already assessed as negligible, said Commander Sarethvel from the far end of the table. Negligible, Dravik agreed, and yet. He let the silence sit. Velanthas watched the commanders. They were a mixed assembly, 6 species, 12 individuals, a combined military history spanning 4,000 years of successful expansion. Every single one of them was being careful. She noticed how they held their bodies, the small signals of controlled discomfort. And yet, she said, since no one else was finishing the thought, we haven't moved. 3 previous expansion fleets have been tasked with human space, Dravik said, not looking at her. The 7th Fleet under Grand Admiral Tos Venath, the 3rd and 9th combined under Marshal Deravanak, and the expeditionary force assembled by the Kreth hegemony before their incorporation. He paused. All 3 have made contact with human space. None of them pressed the engagement. They retreated, Velanthas asked. They returned. He drew a distinction she didn't immediately understand. They did not retreat, they returned. Their ships were intact. Their commanders reported no battle damage, no casualties beyond standard transit losses. They simply, another pause. This one lasted long enough that Velanthas felt her crest feathers rise despite herself. Came back. And filed what kind of reports? Dravik placed 3 data cylinders on the table, one at a time. The deliberateness of it felt almost ceremonial. That, he said, is what you are here to determine. The first report was filed by Grand Admiral Tos Venath of the 7th Fleet, 43 years ago. The 7th Fleet was, and this was not a small thing, the largest single military force the Dominion had ever assembled. 47 capital ships, 219 support and strike craft, enough combined firepower to reduce a planet's surface to glass in a matter of orbital cycles. Velanthas read Tos Venath's report carefully. Then she read it again. It was not what she expected. It was not a strategic assessment. It was not a battle report. It contained no engagement statistics, no planetary defense evaluations, no population compliance projections. It was, as best she could classify it, a series of observations, written in a tone she had never once encountered in a military document before, a tone she eventually identified, after some effort, as *uncertainty. The Seventh Fleet had arrived at the edge of human space and conducted standard surveillance of the outermost inhabited planet, a world the humans called, in their own language, something that translated approximately as the place where the river meets the stone, a name that Tosveneth had found inexplicably significant enough to include verbatim in his report. The surveillance lasted 11 days. On the third day, the fleet's long-range sensors detected that the humans were aware of them. This was not unusual. Most pre-expansion species detected Dominion survey fleets within the first week. What happened next was unusual. The humans did not increase their military posture. They did not scramble defense platforms. They did not broadcast emergency communications to their inner systems. They sent a single vessel, unarmed by every scan the fleet could perform, a ship roughly the size of one of the Seventh Fleet's mid-range scout craft, broadcasting on an open frequency that every species in the Central Arm used for non-hostile contact. Tosveneth had allowed the contact. He had been curious. What came through the channel was a human. Young by their biological standards, Velanthas had learned to estimate the smoothness of the face. The clarity of the eyes were indicators the xenobiologists had catalogued. The human was wearing clothing that appeared to be civilian. And the first thing the human said, in clear, already translated Dominion standard, which meant they'd been listening to Dominion communications for some time, was not a plea, was not a threat, was not a greeting exactly. The human said, "We figured you'd show up eventually. Do you want to talk before or after you've made your decision?" Tosveneth's report noted that it had taken his communications officers several moments to formulate a response. Because the question implied something about the fleet's decision-making process, that none of them had expected a pre-expansion species to simply no. "They knew you were there to decide whether to invade," Velanthas said aloud. She was alone in the analysis room by then. Dravik had left her with the data cylinders and 2 days to form conclusions. She had the habit of speaking to empty rooms. It helped her think. "That's not the interesting part," she said. "The interesting part is that they made it a choice. They gave you a before or after, as though the decision was inevitable and only the timing was negotiable." She pulled up the second report. Marshal Deravanik had arrived at human space 11 years after Tosveneth. The Third and Ninth combined were a different kind of force, not as large as the Seventh Fleet, but faster, more surgical. The Dominion had developed new doctrine in the intervening decade, partly informed by Tosveneth's inconclusive observations. The new approach was to arrive, assess rapidly, and either engage or withdraw within 6 orbital cycles. Deravanik had arrived, assessed, and in the report listed the following findings under the heading *anomalous human behaviors requiring further study*. 1. Human settlements on the target world's second continent showed evidence of having been almost completely destroyed approximately 2 decades prior, by human forces acting against other humans. The settlements had been rebuilt. The humans who rebuilt them appeared to include survivors of the destruction. 2. Sensor sweeps of the human military installations showed that the defense systems were, objectively, insufficient to stop the combined fleet. The humans appeared to know this. Intercepted internal communications showed that human military commanders were discussing not whether they could stop the fleet, but what they would do after initial defensive lines failed. 3. A human was captured non-violently during a probe insertion that encountered a civilian vessel and questioned. The human was uninjured, unrestrained, and offered complete cooperation. She answered every question asked of her. She provided detailed information about human population centers, resource locations, and infrastructure. And then she said something that Deravanik had flagged in bold, in the original document, in the military equivalent of triple underlining. "I'm telling you all of this because it doesn't matter." Velanthas set the cylinder down. The room was very quiet. It doesn't matter, she thought. Why doesn't it matter? What does a species know about itself that makes strategic military information feel irrelevant? She didn't have an answer. She was increasingly convinced that she was the wrong person to be asking. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, not about the question, about who the right person was. The right person, as Velanthes discovered on the morning of her second day alone with the files, wasn't a strategist or a xenobiologist or a military historian. The right person turned out to be the only member of the analytical division who had actually been to human space. A junior field researcher named Osivrak, who was technically on administrative leave for what his file described as unauthorized extended contact with a subject species, and who Dravik had apparently forgotten to remove from the building's access list. Osivrak was young, very young by Dominion Bureau standards, and when Velanthes found him in a sub-level archive surrounded by physical documents, he was doing something she had never once seen a Dominion official do. He was reading human literature. "You're Velanthes," he said without looking up. His species had exceptional peripheral vision. "They gave you Tos Venath's files." "And Dara Vanak's," she said, "and the Kreth expeditionary reports." Now he looked up. Something moved through his expression that Velanthes needed a moment to identify, because it was an emotion she associated with much older beings. It was something close to grief. "You haven't gotten to the Kreth report yet," he said. "I was saving it." "Save it longer," he said. "Read the secondary archive files first. The surveillance footage from years 2 through 7, not the military assessments, the raw footage." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a specificity that felt completely out of place for a junior researcher on administrative leave, "Because when you understand what humans are doing in peacetime, what they're actually doing, not what our analysts said they were doing, the Kreth report will mean something different than it would otherwise." Velanthes studied him. "What were we getting wrong?" Osivrak looked back down at his documents. "Everything," he said, "in the most logical, most reasonable, most completely understandable way possible." He paused. "That's what makes it so hard to explain." The secondary archive surveillance files ran to nearly 900 hours of footage captured by passive observation probes, the long-duration monitoring platforms the Dominion seeded into systems it was preparing to assess. The footage had been collected over 7 years, and the official analytical summaries had categorized it under headings like resource management, asterisk social hierarchies, asterisk and conflict behavior patterns. Velanthes started at hour 1 and watched without reading the summaries first. 3 hours in, she stopped the playback. She rewound, watched again. The footage showed a human settlement in what appeared to be a post-industrial recovery zone, a region where, the probe data confirmed, some kind of catastrophic infrastructure collapse had occurred roughly a decade earlier. Thousands of humans were dead, entire sections of the settlement destroyed. The surrounding land showed signs of long-term contamination. And the humans were building. Not being directed to build, not under visible coercion, simply building, carrying materials, planning, arguing with each other loudly, gesturing at drawings and models, and then continuing to build despite the arguments. There were humans in the footage who appeared to be very old. There were children. There were beings who, even through a probe lens at significant distance, were visibly suffering, moving with the careful deliberateness of chronic pain, stopping frequently, taking longer than the others to complete the same tasks. They didn't stop. In the 7th hour of footage, a section of new construction collapsed. 3 humans were injured. Velanthes watched the others pull them free, watched medics respond, watched someone she'd begun to think of as a site coordinator, a human who appeared in hundreds of hours of footage, always at the center of activity, stand at the edge of the collapse, looking at the rubble. For exactly 40 seconds, The coordinator didn't move. Then they turned around and started talking to someone, planning, pointing. They rebuilt the section. 40 seconds, Velanthas said to the empty archive room. The whole thing falls down and you take 40 seconds. She wasn't criticizing. She was trying to understand what that meant. What kind of internal architecture produced a being who could watch their work destroyed and be back in motion in 40 seconds? She had a terrible feeling she was starting to understand. She watched 600 more hours over the next 2 days. The pattern didn't change. It escalated. Every time she thought she'd found the limit, the moment where human persistence would give way to rational withdrawal, to the simple biological imperative to preserve energy and avoid futile expenditure, the humans found another 40 seconds. Another pivot. Another version of the same relentless motion forward. She watched them fail, repeatedly and badly, at things that should have been simple. She watched them persist through the failures. She watched them celebrate the failures, sometimes in ways that made no immediate sense, gathering, making noise, apparently treating a near-catastrophic setback as something worth commemorating. On the 407th hour of footage, she found the moment Osivrak had wanted her to see. A different settlement, smaller, a community that the probe data suggested had been completely isolated for approximately 3 years during the same infrastructure collapse, cut off, no outside supply, no communication with larger population centers. The footage showed them at the end of year 3, when contact was finally reestablished. Dominion analysts had categorized this event under * survivor recovery operations and noted it as evidence of * functional central governance. The summary was technically accurate. What the summary left out was the faces. The humans who came to reestablish contact, relief workers, the footage metadata suggested, arrived and found the isolated community not in the state of desperate collapse that the analysts had projected based on resource modeling. They found them alive, functional, organized, with a school, and Velanthas had to watch this 3 times to believe the probe wasn't malfunctioning, with what appeared to be a functioning art space. Paintings on walls, sculptures made from salvage. The relief workers stood at the entrance to the settlement and stared. One of the isolated community members walked up to them, said something. The translation software, calibrated for standard social exchanges, produced a partial rendering. We weren't sure anyone was coming. We decided to act as if it mattered whether they did. The relief worker said nothing for a long moment. Then how? And the community member said something that the translation software rendered imperfectly. It flagged a philosophical concept that didn't map cleanly to any Dominion language, but the closest approximation was, we kept doing the next thing. Velanthas turned off the footage. She sat in the archive for a very long time. Then she picked up the 3rd data cylinder, the Kreth Expeditionary Report. And now, because she understood what the humans were doing in peacetime, she understood exactly what she was reading. The Kreth hegemony no longer existed as an independent political entity. They had been incorporated into the Dominion 22 years ago, an expansion that had proceeded smoothly and according to standard doctrine. Their military had been formidable. Their resistance had lasted 18 months and ended with a comprehensive settlement that was, by Dominion standards, considered a model engagement. The Kreth had encountered human space before their incorporation, and their expeditionary force, smaller than either the 7th Fleet or the Combined, but experienced and well-commanded, had done something that neither Tosveneth nor Daravanak had done. They had landed. Not an invasion, a probe landing. A small survey team, 12 Kreth specialists, touching down on the surface of a human world at a location they'd assessed as having low population density. The population density assessment had been correct. What the assessment hadn't captured was what low population density meant on the ground in human territory, because the humans who lived in that area were not isolated from the broader human network. They were, and this was the part that took Velantha's 3 readings to fully absorb, exactly the same as every other human population she'd observed. The smallness of the settlement was not an indicator of marginalization or resource scarcity. It appeared to be an asterisk choice. The Kreth survey team was met by 7 humans. The humans were not armed, or rather, and the Kreth commander's notation here was careful and precise. They did not appear to be carrying weapons in any configuration the Kreth survey team's equipment could identify. What the team's xenobiology specialist had asterisk noted, in an appendix to the main report that Dominion analysts had filed under cultural observations, non-military, the humans were covered in scars. Not 1 or 2, not battle scars in the way that Dominion military culture understood them. Significant wounds, few in number, preserved with some deliberateness as indicators of combat experience. These were the ordinary scars of ordinary human existence, dozens on each visible surface, the accumulated record of a life in a physical world. The Kreth specialist had noted them because the Kreth themselves scarred minimally. Their biology repaired surface damage quickly and completely. And so the sight of that much accumulated physical history written on a body had registered as significant in a way it might not have to a species that shared the trait. The survey team had spent 4 days with those 7 humans. The Kreth commander's report said, "We cannot recommend engagement at this time. No further military justification, no strategic analysis, no resource assessment." Just that one sentence. And then appended in what appeared to be the commander's personal notation rather than official report formatting. They kept asking us questions about ourselves, not our military capacity, not our technology, not our intentions. They asked where we were from, what we found beautiful, what we feared. And then they listened, actually listened. The xenobiology specialist noted that by the end of day 2, she was answering truthfully. I believe all of us were. Velantha's read the notation several times. They asked what you feared, she thought, and you told them. Why? What was it about being genuinely asked, actually asked, by someone who would actually listen, that had caused 12 Kreth military specialists to lower their guard to beings they'd arrived to assess for conquest? She was close to the answer. She could feel it, the shape of it. She went back to HFY. He was still in the sub-level archive. He had apparently been there since she'd last seen him. There was food on his desk, self-prepared, from the look of it, brought from somewhere in the building, and the stack of human literature had gotten larger. "You read it," he said. "I read it." She sat down across from him. "I need you to tell me what happened when you went to human space." He was quiet for a moment. "That's why I'm on administrative leave." "I know. I was there for 4 months." He looked at the documents on his desk rather than at her. Authorized surveillance only at first. Then there was a ship, a human vessel, small, civilian registration. It was having mechanical trouble. I was the closest asset. There was no regulation that specifically covered the situation. "So you helped." "They would have died," he said, with a flatness that suggested he'd had this conversation with himself many times. "The environmental system was failing. I helped. And then I spent 3 months talking to them." He finally looked at her. To the crew, 3 humans, they were merchants, technically, long-haul freight. They'd been running a route for 12 years between 2 of their outer systems. He paused. "Do you know what they talked about for those 3 months? Not politics, not the Dominion, not the fact that they were talking to an alien who could have been a vanguard for an invasion fleet. What did they talk about?" "Their families," HFY said. "Their route, the things they'd seen, the cargoes they'd carried that turned out to matter medicine to a colony that was running out, machine parts that saved a settlement's water recycler, seeds. They'd carried seeds once, experimental crop varieties, to a world that was struggling to feed itself, and they talked about that for 3 hours, whether the seeds had worked. They didn't know. They'd never gone back to find out. He stopped. One of them said that not knowing was the hardest part, that they thought about it all the time, whether it had worked. Valanthas waited. The second month, Osivrak continued, I told them who I was, what the Bureau was, what we did. She felt something tighten in her chest, and the oldest one, she was the captain, she said, we figured, just like that, we figured. And then she said, he stopped, collected himself. She said, asterisk, how much time do you think we have? And I realized she wasn't asking about my departure schedule. The room was very quiet. She was asking about the invasion assessment, Valanthas said. Yes. What did you tell her? Osivrak was quiet for a long time. I told her I didn't know, which was true. He picked up one of the documents, a page of human writing he'd been annotating. She nodded, and then she said, then we'd better keep doing what we're doing. He set the page down. I asked her what that meant. She said, asterisk, building things, making sure people know each other, teaching the children, the usual. The usual, Valanthas repeated. The usual, like that was the obvious answer, like there was no other possible response to the information that a vastly more powerful civilization was deciding whether to erase everything she'd ever known. He looked at Valanthas with an expression that had stopped trying to be professional. That's when I understood what they are, what they've always been, what every fleet, every survey, every analyst got wrong because they were looking for the wrong thing. Tell me, Valanthas said, tell me exactly. We kept looking for their defense, Osivrak said, their strategy, their hidden capability, the secret that explained why 3 expansion fleets walked away. He shook his head. There's no secret, there's no hidden military asset, there's no strategic deterrent. He looked at the stack of human literature. What Tosvenath's fleet saw when they came to the edge of human space was a species that had already survived everything. Collapsed civilizations, self-inflicted ecological disasters, diseases that should have erased them, wars against themselves that made anything we could threaten look modest in scale. They'd been through it, all of it, and they were still building. He paused. And then a fleet of 47 capital ships showed up on their border, and a young human opened a channel and asked if we wanted to talk asterisk before or after we'd made our decision, because for them, it was just another thing. Just another obstacle, just another morning where you wake up and do the next thing. Valanthas stared at him. The Kreth specialist who noted the scars, she said slowly. She wasn't nodding cultural difference. She was nodding evidence, Osivrak said. Evidence of everything they'd already survived, written on their bodies. He leaned forward. Valanthas, every other species we've ever expanded against when faced with a Dominion fleet, they either fight or they surrender, because those are the 2 rational responses. You are either strong enough to resist or you are not. You either have the capacity or you don't. That is how civilized military logic works. And humans, he said, do not experience the world in terms of what they can survive. They experience it in terms of what they are going to do next. The Dominion showing up is not a terminal condition. It's a morning. It's a thing that's happening. And then they figure out what to do about it. He sat back. You can't conquer a species that doesn't experience conquest as a final state. The silence lasted a long time. They'd have fought us, Valanthas said finally. Of course. And they'd have lost. Initially, Osivrak said, with a precision that sent something cold through her. Initially, yes, because they know they'd have lost initially too. That's in Daravanek's intercepts, the human commanders talking about what to do after the first defensive lines failed. Not whether, after, he paused. And then there'd have been a second wave of resistance, and then a third, and they'd have rebuilt between waves, and they'd have kept doing the next thing. And every commander would have had to decide, how long are we willing to continue this? And the humans wouldn't have been asking that question. Not ever. Because for them, it's not how long are we willing to continue. It's just what is the next thing. Valanthas stood slowly. We have to write a report. I know. Dravik's not going to like it. I know that too, Osivrak gathered his documents. There's one more thing in the literature. He handed her a single page, something he'd flagged. Annotated in his own hand in the margins. Human historical record, one of their earlier civilizations. A saying they used. It didn't translate well at the time, which is why the xenolinguistics team buried it in a footnote. But given everything else. She took the page, read the passage, read it again. The saying was simple, linguistically unremarkable. The kind of thing that, removed from context, might have seemed like a general philosophical observation rather than a civilizational operating principle. We don't stop because we're finished. We stop when it's done. And below that, Osivrak had written a single question. Who decides when it's done? The report took them 6 days to write. Not because the findings were complicated. They were, in the end, simple enough to state in a single paragraph. The human species does not possess a military deterrent, a hidden strategic asset, or an undiscovered technological capability that explains the withdrawal of 3 Dominion expansion forces. What they possess is a relationship with adversity that does not include the concept of terminal defeat. Engagement would be successful in conventional military terms and catastrophic in temporal ones. A conquered human population remains a human population. The conquest never ends. What took 6 days was deciding how to phrase the conclusion. In the end, Velanthes wrote it herself, because she was the senior analyst and it was her name going on the document, and also because she was the one who'd sat for 600 hours watching them build things in the ruins of other things they'd built, and she felt she'd earned the right to say it in the plainest possible language. The Dominion can take human space. It will take it cleanly, quickly, and with minimal military losses. The subsequent pacification operation will last longer than the Dominion. This is not a strategic projection. This is pattern recognition. These people outlasted conditions that would have ended any civilization we have ever assessed. Not because they are stronger, not because they are better, because they do not stop. They do not have, in their psychological architecture, the mechanism by which a species decides to stop. We observe them rebuilding a settlement that their own people destroyed. We observe them maintaining culture and education in complete isolation with no certainty of rescue. We observe their commanders planning the phase after total defensive failure, and their civilians responding to imminent invasion with the phrase, "We'd better keep doing what we're doing." Humanity is not a military threat. Humanity is a permanent condition. Conquest would not change them. It would give them something to rebuild toward. Recommendation: non-engagement indefinitely. Additional note, appended by Senior Curator Velanthes, asterisk. There is a photograph in the intake file, a human child in rubble holding something alive, smiling. I have reviewed intake files for 11,000 worlds. I have never been unable to categorize a face. I cannot categorize that face. I have shown it to 17 colleagues. None of them can either. I believe the correct interpretation may be this: the child is not smiling despite the rubble. The child is smiling because the creature in her hands is alive, and she found it in the rubble, and she is going to take it somewhere better. The rubble is not, for her, the subject of the photograph. It never was. I recommend that this photograph be appended to every future assessment file for human contact, not as an object of study, as a warning, not of what humans will do to us, of what they have already done to everything the universe has ever put in front of them. They kept doing the next thing. They are still doing the next thing. They will be doing the next thing long after the reasons we stopped watching them have become the kind of ancient, embarrassing miscalculation that civilizations prefer not to include in official histories. We did not fail to understand humanity's strength. We failed to understand that they had found something we had not and would not, and perhaps could not, asterisk. They had found that being unfinished is not a weakness. It is the only thing that has ever mattered. The report was filed. The War Council reviewed it. Fleet Lord Dravik sat with the physical photograph, the child, the rubble, the living thing held in small hands for a long time before placing it back in the file. He did not issue an invasion order. He did not explain why in those terms to the council. He said instead that the strategic calculus had shifted, that further assessment was warranted, that the Bureau's analysis recommended patience. All of that was true. What he didn't say, what he would not say, because he was Fleet Lord Dravik and he had not risen to this position by admitting to things he couldn't strategize around, was that he had looked at that photograph and understood, with a finality that sat in his chest like a stone, that he had seen a species that had already been through the end of the world. Multiple times. And had looked up from it and found something alive and smiled. The galaxy was very large and very old, and it had produced wonders that still defied classification. It had produced civilizations that spanned systems, minds that could perceive in spectra no biological eye had ever evolved to see, intelligences so vast and patient they made geological time feel urgent. But somewhere in the central arm, on 17 worlds orbiting ordinary stars, a species that had been born in violence and dragged itself bleeding out of its own worst centuries was building things again, teaching children again, carrying seeds to worlds that needed them and wondering, years later, whether they'd grown. Not because they had won. Not because they were safe. Because it was the next thing. Because it was always the next thing. Because somewhere in the architecture of a mind shaped by 10,000 years of survival, stopping, was simply not a state they had ever learned to occupy. The galaxy had looked at humanity and asked, what is your defense? What is your deterrent? What is the secret thing that keeps you safe? And the answer that 3 fleets had circled and never quite named and come home unable to explain, was that there was no defense. There was no deterrent. There was no secret. There was only a child in the rubble, holding something alive, already thinking about where to go next. There was only 40 seconds. And then the next thing,